Gracias y ante todo tengo que agradecer a los otros organizadores por haber invitado a un historiador de la economía a hablar de textos de Vitoria. Y además tengo que disculparme porque voy pronto a pasar al inglés por presentar mi información. So, if compared with other fields of his thinking, what Vitoria taught on economic matters has been largely overlooked. Only Spanish scholars essentially have devoted some attention, thorough attention to it, like Goya Sarrosa, that was here yesterday, while at the international level, his contribution was essentially neglected. Only recently, in the COP, devoted some passages of his quite influential book, Theologians and Contract Law. Moreover, the existing literature is mostly interested in looking at Vitoria for the roots of the later and extensive treatment that the School of Salamanca really devoted to economic issues. So in that respect, the emphasis typically goes on his pragmatic attitude, some anticipatory insight that hint at a quantity theory of money. But when it comes to link his idea to the previous scholastic traditions, or to earlier scholasticism, things tend to get quite blurred, and there are rather broad references to Aquinas and Thomism, but not a lot more. So, given the approach of this conference, we have to take a different approach, a different way to set the research question. So, what if instead of considering Vitoria as the founder of the School of Salamanca, we look at his writings as the product of the teachings he was able to absorb in Paris? Or in other words, what if we consider Vitoria as the late example of a theological and juridical tradition that is discussing about commerce and finance since at least the 13th century? To do this, we need to analyze his work following a methodology that is currently prevailing among legal specialists, which largely diverges from that of traditional historians of economic thought. And in the last couple of decades, there has been a growing interest for this renovated and different approach, much more similar to intellectual history rather than thinking on economic thought. So, for example, even a superstar economist like Thomas Piketty now recognizes that many economic concepts linked to the modern industrial capitalism originated in the writings of the Western Christian tradition between the 12th and the 15th century. So, essentially, for long, scholars mainly interpreted these texts that wrote about usually just price and the like in two ways. Some followed Jacques Legoff, that saw them as an attempt by ecclesiastical institutions to moralize the beginning of commercial capitalism, and essentially expressing a regard towards most forms of profit. During the early modern period, this tradition evolved into a distinctive Christian view of the economy that, for example, went under the name of Antidora with Bartolomeo Clavero, or Economie Morale with Thomas Fontaine. Others, on the contrary, essentially influenced by Joseph Schumpeter, were much more interested in these texts as forerunners to a modern and scholarly oriented vision of economics. A good example concerning scholasticism is provided by the works of Marjorie Grice Hutchinson, who wrote extensively on the School of Salamanca, or, for example, by Odd Landholm. Both approach these questions, these sources, with methods that commonly are applied by historians of economic thought. However, our understanding of the cultural context in which the late medieval and early modern economy developed has changed and grown significantly. So this has brought to the questioning of both this traditional, well-established interpretation and the emergence of new ones, in particular with reference to the late medieval. So scholars essentially do no longer see these writings as simple discussion on prohibition about usury, and at the same time they tend to dismiss the idea that these are early attempts to find the roots of the modern idea of economy. Rather, they tend to consider them as an effort to describe and codify what was happening in everyday economy within the existing cultural framework. So this involved essentially combining conceptual categories from the Christian tradition with those inherited from Greco-Roman culture, but at the same time, by combining them, innovating. So what this scholarship teaches, essentially on economic matters, tells us that we need to adopt a multi-layered approach, capable of going beyond the simple content of these texts. Look at their structure, their sources, their keywords, as well as the economic and cultural context in which they appear. So, for example, Joel Kay warned us against evolutionary interpretation of medieval economic thought, revealing how it was possible that extremely advanced views emerged in the 13th century and then quickly regressed in the short time of a century. At the same time, Giacomo Todeschini has shown how texts regarding ecclesiastical institutions dating since the High Middle Ages function as reservoir of economic vocabularies, metaphors, and concepts that later heavily influenced scholastic writing from the 13th to the 15th century. So today what I'm going to do is to use this approach to analyze a very specific part of Vittoria's work, because to detect Vittoria's economics, we could look at many, many things. We just heard some very interesting passages about the issues of property and so on. So essentially, questions 77 and 78 of this commentary on the Seconda that deal essentially with trade, just price, then the issue of credit, mostly. And I will analyze first the sources, the structure, and the language in which we can look at these writings. And second, I will look at the content with a focus on essentially 3 selected topics. And lastly, try to draw some preliminary conclusions. So, what about the sources? I think it's necessary to consider 3 different levels of sources that Vittoria uses in the questions. So, alongside the sources that are explicitly mentioned, there are a number of implicit references he makes to concepts deposited and reconveyed by scholastic thinking over a period of 250, 300 years, and that seem to reflow by inertia into the treatment provided by Vittoria, almost as if he was unaware of their origin. At an even deeper level, however, there is obviously the choice that Vittoria has made to comment the Secunda, comment Thomas Aquinas, instead of commenting the sentences, because as we heard yesterday, the typical place where commentaries about the economy, about usury, was book 4 of the sentences, question 15. So how does this somehow change at the content level the approach of Vittoria? Vittoria is selective when he decided what to discuss that he finds in these 2 questions. In many places, he tends to dismiss what Aquinas wrote, at times because he said it's self-evident, but elsewhere because they are somehow what the words of Aquinas are peripheral to what he wants to say. Nonetheless, clearly, there is somehow a sort of continuous confrontation with Aquinas, and Aquinas is always the point of reference when he's talking also about other theologians and other sources. As for theologians and jurists mentioned acting in an explicit way, I could count 25, 30 of them, the earliest dating back to the writings of the 1240s, more or less, so means the 13th century. Commentaries on the Decretals by Pope Innocent IV or the Summa Alexandri that was mentioned yesterday are the earliest. Then, of course, there is a whole variety of sources that Vittoria cites, and essentially it's a balanced mix of canon lawyers, authors of manuals for confessors, and of course, clearly, theologians. The privileged sources of Vitoria when it talks about economic issues are essentially Zumanhart, Mayer, and of course, his confrere Aquinas, Thomas Levi of Cajetan, Sylvester Mazzolini, which is quite relevant, and of course, there are also some Dominicans who one would expect to find that he doesn't cite, like Bartolomeo of San Concordio or John of Freiburg. And in another very significant absence is Bernardino of Siena, the main authority in the field during the 15th century, though through references made by Antonino of Florence, who extensively used Bernardino, his writing, we have the impression that Vitoria had indirectly access to Bernardino's view. Among the Franciscans, it's not surprising to see very little number of Franciscans cited by Vitoria, but essentially two scholars, and Angelo of Timasso, who is a writer of a very influential manual for professors. But if you look closer to questions 77 and 78, looking for implicit references, the picture slightly changes, and the weight of what Odd Lancome has labeled the Franciscan school increases. The staples of this line of reasoning are mostly indirectly conveyed by Antonino Florence, Zumanhart, and Mayer, but at times there are connections that are a bit more clear. For instance, without making any reference to the source, Vitoria argues that a girl accepting 1,000 ducats for having sexual intercourse can retain the money, although her profit derives from a sinful act. This passage closely recalls an argument very common among Franciscan theologians when it came to discuss ill-gotten gains, such as gambling and prostitution. So there are elements that suggest that perhaps that I still have to look more closely, that this connection with the Franciscan is in some cases direct. The structure. Well, clearly, if we take a look at the structure of the two questions, again, there is a break with the past. Up until now, essentially, economic issues were discussed with reference to the sentences or in specific treatises on contracts, like Bernardino's, for example, or in sections of manuals for confessors that were devoted to usury, buying and selling, and the like. Now the template is the Secunda Secunda. We know in retrospect that we're in a sort of a transition, because the way in which the treatises, the Justitia et Iure of the School of Salamanca will be structured is much more organized than these two questions. So in some way, the template that Vitoria decided to adopt favored this transition, but it was not already a full transition, not a full change. But this is essentially an opportunity to focus on an element that is very interesting from my point of view about Vitoria, this idea of a transition from 15th century ways of discussing about economics and the standard treatment that would emerge in the second half of the 16th century. I already said that the way in which he discusses question 77 and 78, in which he absorbs Aquinas, is a very flexible one. And in following Aquinas, essentially, Vitoria repeats the structure that typically emerged and was the standard way in which you should discuss economic issues in the 15th century. There were sections addressing the issue from a theological perspective, including divine law and spiritual reference, other devoted to speculative features, where natural law was at the core. Eventually came the section specifically concerned with contracts, first considered in theory, then in practice, by means of a case-by-case analysis. And actually, if we zoom in question 78, which is devoted essentially to credit and usury, the structure is essentially the same, and the way in which Vitoria carries out his analysis is not so much similar, for example, as the way in which is organized by John Mayer, much more similar to that, for example, that one you could find in a manual for confessors like that of Sylvester Priero, or the typical treatises on contracts at this time. So this idea of a sequence of features that were analyzed, typically you would find usura primo, usura secondo, usura tercero, tertio, where theorization went along with a methodical case-by-case studies. But Vitoria is not methodical at all. He's not systematic. He is cherry-picking. He selects some of the hot topics that were in the economic hot topics of that time. So, for example, the so-called triple contract, partnership for cattle breeding, sales on credit, annuities, also known as census contract, money changing, and marine insurance. This latter is an interesting case in point. I said before, it's interesting to discover the merchant background of Vitoria, because Vitoria provides a very thorough and in-depth analysis of what marine insurance is, but at the same time, he does it without a juridical framework. By that time, sources that he had already, he cites in his work, like Adrian Pope, Adrian Sixth, or John Mayer, had somehow started to recognize that there were connections between insurance and other types of contracts related to chance and fortune, so gambling, lotteries, and so on. And later on, in the School of Salamanca, this would be formalized as a specific juridical category, the aleatory contracts category, and it will be discussed always in this way. But, for example, in this case, there is no connection at all made by Vitoria. He doesn't even feel the need to provide a juridical framework. This is always this idea of a case-by-case analysis, and the relevancy of the case-by-case analysis is emerging clearly if we just count the pages that all these different sections occupy in the edition of Bertrand de Heredia. Theological and legal features, 14 pages. Theoretical, juridical, economical, say 9. The study of contracts case by case, 47 pages. So when scholars label Vitoria's approach to economics as pragmatic, they essentially argue, well, he does very little theorization compared to this case-by-case analysis, and at times in the case-by-case analysis, he's not consistent with the theory, the part of his theory. But if we avoid decontextualizing Vitoria's writing, here he essentially follows, like Cajetan did before him, what had become the standard way of discussing about economic topics in the 15th centuries. Case-by-case approach with tended to prevail, for example, in manuals for confessors that at that time had a huge spread in this period. And in this type of sources, a pragmatical case-by-case approach is somehow structured in these sources. And there is a much more reference to the way in which canon lawyers tend to analyze the issues rather than the more rational and organized ways in which the Aristotelian rationalism would suggest. And this really, somehow we can imagine that Vitoria decided to use this type of approach because that was the type of approach that typically audience would be used to consider when discussing this. The huge spread in the painting industry in Spain, for example, manual for professors in this period is a very limited time, so I'm going to be very quick about the other element that is concerned about language, but also the fact that Vitoria appears to have a very strong interest to contextualize with local examples his discussion on contracts. This is something that you see in the 15th century literature about this topic, but in the case of Vitoria, it's really interesting because Salamanca, for example, is cited in relation to partnership for cattle breeding, wine production, money changing. Antwerp, we mentioned yesterday, and the Flanders about the triple contract. Several European cities are mentioned, making a camp, of course, for a whole number of financial activities. This looks a lot more like the context in which other literary genres that talked about economy at that time would locate a discussion. Cuestiones disputate and quadrupeds, no? That had a very close connection with local issues. And this idea of somehow having a connection with the audience, the local environment, and so on, emerges as well in the use of vernacular that in these two questions is very, very visible, much more than other examples I have in mind at that time. And it's on the one side for explaining technicalities, so you find vender por menudo, but at times you have like 5 lines all in Spanish. And Spanish is everywhere. So at that time, you would say likely that this is a way to get in touch with the audience. I'm not so sure because really the type of audience at university lessons is not an audience that has difficulties in understanding Latin. However, the use of technical terms in Spanish probably show us that to be more clear, to make examples that are more connected to the everyday economy, he opted for this solution. And this is something that you see, but not so much in literature of this kind in the 15th century. Very limited time to discuss about the contents. I want to provide at least 2 examples that are relevant. The first one is the discussion about prices, of commerce and prices, and the second one is about a legal title, or we can also name it an economic principle, that is lucumquescens, the idea that you can have an interest in lending money. Here, the subtitle of my intervention is: do we see continuity or change in Vitoria when he discusses these topics? We see a number of things. So, for example, talking about trade for and prices discussion is always in theological writings framed into the more general topic of trade, of long-distance trade, to be more precise. And while for Aquinas, essentially merchants should lawfully only expect a compensation for work, stipendium laboris is the term that Aquinas uses, and the profit of merchants should essentially only be needed to provide for their family, the Franciscan tradition pushes much further this idea, and beginning with the Summa Alexandrina, and then later on with Richard of Mediavilla. And this version is essentially stabilized by Scotus, who writes that long-distance trade is the result of varying geographical distribution of goods and commodities, from which derive the need to transfer them from where they are in abundance to where they are scarce. And the profit of merchants is lawful because they do this service, no? They act for the common good of cities and states. This becomes a staple in the discussions of the 15th century. And also somehow it expands from the specific argument, the specific topic of commerce, to any type of activity that somehow favors commerce. So, for example, money changers can earn money because they're useful, because they favor the development of trade. And insurers, same, bankers, the same. It's interesting enough to see that also in Vitoria there is this tendency to expand this idea. And for example, he uses very praiseworthy words to save some credit, which is an activity that traditionally was seen with suspicion, in particular by Aquinas. And on the contrary, he considers the merchants who use this type of technique extremely useful, because there is a lack of coins circulating at that time in Spain. And without this technique, many trade activities would stop. Skip other two elements to move to lucrum tesens. So essentially, lucrum tesens is seen as one of the mechanisms, the rationale through which lending on interest becomes a topic that is somehow acceptable by scholasticism. The classic example was that of a merchant who agreed to lend his money to someone instead of investing the money in a business venture. Any profit the merchant probably would have made in that venture because of lucrum essence, the seizing of profit, was to be lawfully added to the repayment of the loan. So Thomas Aquinas was not at all in favor of that. And in the 13th century, the acceptance of this title to interest was mainly among jurists, Romanists, and Franciscans. In Article 2 of the Question 78, Vitoria devotes plenty of space to this issue, and his main source is Cajetan. Because Cajetan found somehow a way to argue in favor of lucrum essence while avoiding to openly go against Aquinas, which was something difficult in this case. So the distinction that Vitoria makes is very subtle, scholastic, between lucrum in potentia and lucrum in spec. It is used essentially to say what? That money in itself is not productive, because otherwise this would somehow go against the theories, the ideas of Aquinas and the ideas of Aristotle. Consider it's there. What does it mean? According to Vitoria, it means somehow that only a merchant who routinely profits from its business can lawfully claim an interest with lucrum in spec. It is, however, a step forward, because as the example that I provided before the idea was that for a single economic, we focused on a single economic venture, we weren't able to invest in that venture, and therefore you had the money in exchange. The idea of Vitoria is people who normally, all year round, make money with merchant activity. If they lend money, they can claim interest because of lucrum essence. So there is much more the idea that economic activity and financial activity are in a flow and not limited to singular contracts. And you have somehow to keep into account this. This is on the theory level. When it comes to the case-by-case application, the situation is a bit more blurred, so somehow there's this re-emergence of this idea that is pretty pragmatical. So in some cases he accepted it, in some other cases he rejects this idea. Perhaps the most interesting case, again, concerns sales on credit. Why Vitoria clarifies that merchants cannot use the principle per se, lucrum essence, to justify the price increase in a delayed payment, that is typical in the sale of credit. He de facto internalizes this increase in the price, this interest, because he said that essentially there are two different markets that are not related one with each other. There is a market for everyday commodities, that are necessary, and there's a market for more expensive commodities that has a totally different price. And in that market, there is an increase in price that is totally legitimate. And when you were talking about the service, the fact that his family was in the wool business, these are typical contracts that were used in the wool business. So he perfectly understands that these are two totally different situations. And of course, he said that a merchant who normally sells on cash cannot switch to the other type of market to claim local presence. You have to be a specialist. You have to be a person who is in it. So, to conclude, just a couple of general ideas about this overview that is clearly part of being complete. Question 66 probably will provide a lot more information about the general broad idea of Vitoria on more theoretical issues as well, issues of property and so on. But I think that the idea of taking the angle, looking backwards, no, instead of looking forward, looking at Vitoria as a late medieval theologian from the point of view of his economic writings, shows, for example, that there is no clear cut between the earlier tradition and the school of Salamanca. No? We can use somehow Vitoria as this is, I mean, self-evident, but it's interesting from the point of view of especially because considering Vitoria as a sort of a broker between the previous tradition and the school of Salamanca can be very helpful because we lack of a lot of studies about the transition between the late 15th century and the school of Salamanca. The second concerns the image of Vitoria provided by looking backwards, say. I think that my survey, I didn't have to go to other examples, but provided that this idea that on economic topics, Vitoria is a Thomist is not realistic. No, there is a lot of elements that originated in the Franciscan school that resurface in the discourse of Vitoria, probably because of Antonino of Florence and Angelo of Pivasso. I have the impression that perhaps one conveyor could also be John Mayer, because there is the impression that John Mayer probably had direct access to the writings of what is now considered the most advanced, and this is termed as a proper economist of the Middle Ages, Peter John Olivi, whose work circulated anonymously because he was condemned for ecclesiastical theological reasons, not related to economic thinking, and in Major you find some passages that clearly echo something that was not present in Bernardino of Siena, for example. So does this connection transform Vitoria into a follower of the Franciscan school? Absolutely not. There are several examples in which we see that in the end he sort of reinterprets the Franciscan tradition much more in line with the 15th century tradition that essentially standardized and downplayed, depotentiated the most modern, and I use the improper term, element of this Franciscan school, which is an indirect confirmation of the fact that there is, as Joel Gale argued, it's hard to talk about in this period about economic ideas, economics writing in an evolutionary way. We have moments that appear to be very advanced and moments that are sorry for being long.